Our panelists for this session are Scott D. Anthony, Senior Partner at the Growth Strategy Consultancy, Innosight, and co-author of Dual Transformation, How to Reposition Today's Business While Creating the Future, and Michael Putz. Michael is a strategy and business development executive with 2 decades of experience driving growth through disruptive innovation and business transformation. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Yeah, Paul.
Paul, Karen, thanks for having both of us. It's a delight to be here.
Great to see you both.
Well, terrific. Let's dive right in, and let's begin at the beginning. So implied clearly in this session's title and explored in your work is the notion that leaders still do not fully understand disruption, even 25 years after Christensen first identified the Innovators Dilemma. So Michael, let's bring you up first. Let's do a quick refresh on the Innovators Dilemma and why it so stubbornly persists.
Well, thank you, Paul, for having us here today. And the Innovators Dilemma is, when it first came out, it was something was brand new and challenging. It was also a technical challenge that people really that were unfamiliar with. But over the last 25 years since Clay's offered this article up to the world, it's been clear that we've had a lot of practice. A lot of people have been successful at moving through the implementation, working with people like Scott and his company, Innosight, in terms of implementing the Innovators Dilemma in real life practice. And so we've seen a lot of success stories as well as failures, but a lot of success stories of people who've applied the principles of disruptive innovation. The question is not really why the dilemma persists, but why is it the success not more widespread? And that's really what I think really what I want to say this. I think people have done very well. There are a lot of success stories, but why are there not more? And I think that's really what we're trying to speak to in our article is why can't there be more people more successful more frequently? And so there's not just a few winners. And I think really the challenge is that it used to be a technical challenge that people were not familiar. Now the question is, why do people sometimes fail even with the best of intentions? And so that's really the issue. And we see we talk about the lies people tell themselves, but it really comes down to the fact that disruptive innovation is something that's not only different, but the opposite of sustaining innovation in terms of the practices, the models, the values that you have to practice. And the challenge is that requires a very different mindset. Matter of fact, the opposite mindset of a sustaining innovation. Sustaining innovation is one school of discipline and thought. Disruption is a different one, and they're oppositional. And because they're oppositional, it requires us to toggle between mindsets that are so different, it's very difficult to do. And it's difficult to do, and it's not a matter of intelligence, it's not a matter of skill, it's really a matter of awareness. And oftentimes that awareness is about ourselves, about our values, how we operate as leaders, what our values of our organization. A lot of those things could be unconscious biases. We have to be able to have that perspective for ourselves, for our teams and our organizations, and it requires a level of discipline that we oftentimes don't have to practice or haven't had the opportunity to practice. And that's a lot of what the real persistence of the Innovators Dilemma is about.
So is this a strategic challenge or a leadership challenge? How do we balance those two?
Well, I think it's a both and. It requires a discipline that many leaders talk about of looking to the future, working from the future backwards. We have to have that strategic discipline, but a lot of excellent companies have that. But oftentimes the question is, why do we then fall short of implementing those strategic plans that a lot of the people who follow this journal have the skills to implement? And a lot of times they fall short because they haven't been able to toggle the mindsets. It's a lot of times it's a strategic offsite about the future, but can I bring it back into practice? It's a discipline that I have to practice on a daily or weekly or monthly basis and develop skill with, as opposed to being an offsite or an activity.
If I can just add one thing. Just one thing to that, Paul. So if you look at the school of thought that Clay was from, the resource-based view of the firm, going back to Joe Bauer and other great scholars, one of the big beliefs in that view of the firm is that the right strategy is never more than 49% of the answer. So yes, of course, there's been a lot of work that has been done to help people formulate strategically how to respond to disruptive change, and it's wholly insufficient because you also have to go and execute it, and that requires leadership, and that requires driving it inside the culture of the organization.
Right. So at the core of the persistence of this challenge, right, are the delusions that many leaders kind of bring bring to their thinking about innovation. So Scott, I'm gonna give the floor over to you to talk about some of those delusions.
Yeah, well, of course, the whole innovator's dilemma, it rests on one of those big delusions, which is the idea that your customers tell you what you should do. So the basic idea of the innovator's dilemma, for those of you who might not still be familiar with the work, is in certain circumstances, you listen to your best customers, you do exactly what they tell you to do, better, improved versions of what you're currently doing, and you miss the big industry shift where someone comes in and changes the paradigm with something that's simple, that's accessible, that's affordable. And the lesson from Christensen's original research is sometimes listening to your customers can be the wrong thing to do because they unintentionally lie to you. That's kind of the primary argument in the innovator's dilemma. Where we try to advance is to say, well, what are other lies that leaders tell themselves that cause them to miss disruptive signals or mismanage response to disruptive change? And there were 4 key ones we identified in the article. The first is the data tells us we are safe. Remember, data tells you about the past, not about the future. You can be in the midst of a disruptive storm and report record revenues and record profits. The second thing that you will hear people say is our shareholders won't let us, that we don't have the freedom to go and do this, where in fact you absolutely do if you manage your shareholders in the right sort of way. You'll have people say that our people aren't up to the task. They don't have the innate skills to be able to respond to disruptive change. They absolutely do. We can talk more about counterexamples to this if you'd like, but you have to release them and deal with some of the issues that Michael talked about. And the fourth thing we identified in the article is people will say, it's too risky to do this. It's too risky to bet on disruption. It's too risky to invest in innovation. Think about that for a second. Think about a notable failure that's occurred in the innovation field. And you might imagine Google Glass or Microsoft Zune or a range of other things. And those are not good things. But when companies make big bets on innovation, the most they can lose is the amount they invest. The most they can gain is limitless. They can create entirely new ecosystems. When they don't invest in innovation, the most they gain, 0. The most they lose is their entire organization. So what's the risky thing to do? Is it to invest in innovation or to not invest in innovation? I think it's pretty clear. So those are the key things we identified in the article.
So let's talk about a couple of those in a little bit more detail. When are customers right and when not? How do we know when to listen? I don't think you're suggesting that we should ignore our customers altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say 2 things here, and of course we could say a lot more about this. But Michael introduced the fundamental categorization scheme that Christensen used, sustaining versus disruptive. So in sustaining circumstances, when what you offer is not yet good enough to solve fundamental customer problems in a given tier of the market, the customers can be very reliable guides to what it takes to deliver against the problem they're trying to solve. So when you're in a known established market and you're still trying to make things better so customers can draw more utility out of your products, absolutely, existing customers can lead the way. That also points to the other way that customers can guide you. And this was a theme of the book, Competing Against Luck, which is one of the ones that Karen wrote with Clay, along with my colleague, Dave Duncan. The idea in that book, as many people who follow Christensen and Innosight will know, is that the job to be done, the problem the customer is trying to solve, is essentially true north when it comes to innovation. Customers don't always have language to describe the problems they're trying to solve. But if you can work to understand what those problems are, those are always fantastic guides to innovation. The challenge, of course, with that is you often can't go ask customers to tell you what the jobs to be done are. It requires work to surface them. But if you do that work, it is hugely valuable input to innovation.
So Michael, I'm going to turn this back over to you and talk about what it means for leaders themselves to operate in this environment. How do we get to a place where we are effective innovation leaders?
Well, one of the key things is, first of all, like we've been talking about, the very nature of the fact that we're stepping out of a context. Like we're fish that swim in water. We've been raised in a discipline of sustaining innovation. And that's what most of our jobs are about. Even in a great company that's a disruptor, their job is to deliver every day on making that disruption better, faster, cheaper for their customers once they've established themselves. So you become a successful disruptor like a Google or an Amazon. A lot of your job is sustaining innovation, even if you're a disruptive company, because what is sustaining to us could be disruptive to somebody else. And so everybody in the game of sustaining innovation, even the great disruptors. So the challenge is having them be able to toggle that mindset, right? Where I basically say, most of my day-to-day job is sustaining innovation, but I have a separate context for disruptive innovation. And when Clay really said in his second book, The Innovators Solution, he basically said the way of solving this dilemma of having an opposite context was to step outside and have a separate organization that created these new disruptions, right? Something that might be disruptive to an Amazon or a Google or a Netflix. If I was something that disrupted to them, I might have a separate organization to do that, that have different values and a different orientation. The challenge is you create a problem of this context switching we talked about. You bump it up to a set of senior leaders who have to embrace that. So you have to understand there's a context where I have to make this toggling on a daily basis. Most of the time, as Clay said, if I have a disruptive organization that has one set of values, let people focus on that, and a sustaining organization have another set of values. The challenge is for a set of senior leaders who have to be able to embrace this, or people who are working at different levels of the organization, they have to span these two functions. Then I have to basically acknowledge this context, first of all, embrace the fact that it's very oppositional and different, and take that as a starting point, which is absolutely essential. People just don't really recognize that fundamental point. They read over and go, yes, 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 I understand that. It's really important to embrace that point and to internalize it, then develop a discipline to say, well, how am I doing? And how am I showing up in this moment, this day, or this hour in a sustaining context or disruptive context, and make that context switch. So once I've acknowledged that necessity, and then I can then have to develop practices and be able to develop internal set of skills to be able to make that context switch happen more readily and work more effectively.
Michael, how is this discipline, right? And it's significant in the easiest of times, I would think, but how is this discipline to context switch challenged by the environment we're living in right now? Is that too much to ask?
It's in some ways, our daily lives have always been challenging, especially for people who are trying to manage in these situations of aggressive change, lots of competitors, lots of demands, your jobs, Scott's jobs, the people that you consult with. They've always been demanding. This time, I think it provides a moment of clarity because we have to step outside ourselves. And stepping outside ourselves is one of the key skills to be able to manage this dilemma, right? I have to be able to step outside myself and examine myself objectively. And it's more essential than ever to have developed that muscle in difficult times. But it's also difficult when we go back to our new normal, whatever that may end up being. It's going to be very essential to develop this capacity, not only for ourselves, but also for our teams and our organizations. But right now, it puts a spotlight when we're in these difficult times to really have that skill for ourselves.
Can we talk a little bit about?
I'm sorry, Paul, can I just add one thing to that? So I think if we were to write the paper right now, we would say another lie that we're hearing leaders say is it isn't the right time for us to do this because we have to focus on making sure that we deal with the issues of today. And of course, you have to, inside any organization, you have to flatten the economic curve. You have to make sure that your business is solvent, your operations are running, your employees are safe. And you have to have the ability to step back, step out, see things for as they are, and recognize no matter how dark the clouds, there is always a silver lining. There are always great opportunities. There are always great things that you can do. It is indeed brutally hard, but to say it isn't the right time to do it is absolutely wrong. There has never been a better time if you really want to push innovation and disruption than in times of dislocation, because that's when opportunities open up. Hard, yes, but important, no doubt.
Is it possible to lean? I mean, I think the inclination of some leaders is to pull back and say it's not the right time. This is scary enough. Then there are leaders who are going to do the opposite. They're going to lean more strongly in, right? Right. Is that always? I mean, is that necessarily the right call?
But I would say that's a judgment call in some situations. But I think the question is, I think, is if having this discipline before it's necessary is absolutely the key, right? Mm-hmm. So if someone has been developing a disciplined approach to disruptive innovation, also a disciplined approach to leadership and their own self-management, then it's going to be so much easier to seize opportunities in this moment or the next opportunity that comes along in this next dislocation. So it's really about developing this capacity. It helps now in this critical moment. It helps now in the future or for the next major dislocation. It's absolutely essential to develop this capacity. There's no time when it's not important to do. And I don't think there's any time you should set this aside. I think it's a great opportunity right now.
Great. So I'm going to begin incorporating some of the great questions that are coming in from our audience. And thank you all very much for your generosity of questions. Scott, this one is for you. How can employees be empowered when they aren't first given job guarantees. So we're asking people to engage in riskier behavior, perhaps with a higher degree of likelihood of failure. Do we need to provide some kind of extraordinary job security before we ask this of people?
So there's a lot loaded into that question, and one could start getting into universal basic income and topics that are above my pay grade. So I don't know that I can talk on the macroeconomic and policy perspective, but let me talk about the word risk. So I think one of the big misperceptions that we have to handle is when we start talking about innovation, doing something different that creates value, pushing to disruptive innovation, we're asking people to take on risk. That is not necessarily the case if we approach it in the right sort of way. So we do have to find ways to manage that risk in the right way. We do have to find ways to make sure our environment can tolerate smart experiments, can tolerate that sometimes those experiments won't work, and we will view that as learning versus failure. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're saying, let's go and take undue risk and do stupid things. Instead, we're going to be very smart about how we manage the risk so we can push in different directions. So
Let's
I
look
don't
at
think,
risk.
the summary answer then is, I don't think we need job guarantees to do it. I think we need to make sure that we have environments that, if you channel Amy Edmondson's research, we have environments that can tolerate intelligent failures. And we want to be really intelligent about how we approach disruption.
Let's look at risk from another perspective. So risk is one thing and shareholder expectations are another. The trap of quarterly earnings guidance is not easy to extract from. So we can urge organizations to take risks, but if their stakeholders aren't willing to go along with that, they can only get so far.
Yeah, so a couple points about this. First, we talk a little bit in the article about the just stunning stream of research that continues to show that if you want to maximize the short-term returns that you're giving to your shareholders, the thing you have to do is to think long-term. So those who think and act short-term paradoxically destroy short-term return for shareholders. So that's point number one that has to be acknowledged. Point number two is this: when people start talking about it, it's often a crutch. They just don't want to do something that is difficult because, again, you have plenty of examples of people who manage to take their shareholders along a journey, sometimes changing some of them because those shareholders wanted to invest in a different sort of company. We talk about Mark Bertolini from Aetna as an example in the article, and there are, of course, other ones. I think the mistake that people make is, one, they assume it's too hard, and number two, they don't tell shareholders the story. So in a book that a couple of my colleagues recently released this week, as a matter of fact, Lead from the Future, Mark Johnson and Josh Suskowitz, the big point is you need a vision, you need a story, and you need a path to get there. So this isn't a CEO telling their shareholders, trust me, it's all going to be okay. It's, here's the destination, here are the milestones along the way, and here's the proof points that I'm actually getting there. You can't have this be based on faith. I mean, it's got to be based on a real well-grounded story and demonstrated results. If you do that, though, you certainly can manage a strategic transformation, drive disruption, and reap the rewards. Is it easy? Of course not. But is it doable? For sure.
So related to that point, we've gotten some questions around measurement. So what are your recommendations around effective measures of innovation, especially for an organization that is moving to a more aggressive posture for the first time?
Well, so I'll start, and Michael, if you want to add anything on that please feel free. But when we think about measuring innovation, this will draw on, of course, some of the great work that Rita McGrath, who will be speaking a little bit later on, has done. It's really about how do you smartly manage the assumptions behind your idea. So you go back to some of McGrath's seminal work, you reverse engineer success. You say, for this to be a big idea, these things need to be true. And how are we systematically turning those assumptions into knowledge? How are we demonstrably increasing what we know and decreasing what we don't know? So that means in the early days of innovation, it's much more about learning than it is about earning. Now, of course, ultimately, innovation has to create value. You're not just doing it for fun. So that has to be tied to a story and an economic model that ultimately will make sense. But as Scott Cook from Intuit famously once said, for every one of our failures, we had spreadsheets that looked awesome. Awesome spreadsheets do not mean awesome ideas. It is really drilling into the assumptions underneath it and addressing them, and recognizing sometimes when you go to try and address an assumption and it turns out that something that you thought was true was false, it's time to stop. And that, again, is a good outcome, not a bad outcome if it happens early enough in the process.
Michael, so there are a couple of questions that I think are in your bailiwick. One audience member described the kind of competing mindsets or ability to move between mindsets as an ambidextrous skill that most managers don't have. Can they learn it on the fly? Is there training available?
Yeah, so the ambidextrous mindset work is, I think, very complementary. I think that we've looked for a way of trying to describe the phenomenon with a discipline model. We basically look towards, there are a variety of different ways of looking at it, but we talked about self-transforming leadership. We talked about the work of Bob Keegan, who talks about different stages of leadership development, about in terms of the ability to basically master a new mindset and then stand outside of a mindset and be able to toggle between them, right? And so there's a lot of wonderful work has been done to describe the nature of this mindset and awareness, but also how to develop it. And there's been a lot of work since the publication of the Innovators Dilemma that has come out. There's been a lot of increase in terms of being able of the tools to basically practically move towards a self-transforming leadership mindset. We talk about self-transforming leadership mindset in our paper. It's the ability to toggle between these two disruptive and sustaining mindsets necessary to be successful in each. And there's a whole set of, I think there's a whole set of programs out there that are tools that are helpful. I don't think there's any one place you can go to say, this is how I become a self-transforming leader today, right? There's no cookie cutter solution to it. But there's a lot of tools that people can start the journey with. And I think we can talk later, maybe in a different, through the different questions here. I think it's really essential to see that there's a whole variety, especially during this COVID-19 emergency. There's a tremendous number of online tools out there right now for people to develop skills for self-introspection, for mindfulness, for personal development, and be able to have this ability to toggle between mindsets. The key is to having the support, not only of doing this yourself, but having peers and having teams to do this. This is not a solo journey. So I think that there's plenty of tools out there, but it's critical to have a supportive environment. If you don't have a team or an organization supporting the development of this capacity, to create a team of your own to do this. And I think it's really critical. This is not a solo act. So I think there's a lot of tools for self-initiation out there. We can talk more about them, but it's really critical to develop peer support to do this. This is a team activity.
I think people who are interested in this would love to hear a tool or two. Don't worry if you're giving a plug for somebody, if you think there are some tools that are useful.
Absolutely. So I think a couple of things out there. So first of all, I'll say mindfulness in general, right? I think mindfulness tools and techniques in general are very wonderful. And everyone can find the tools out there that suit them. There's a vast variety of corporate mindfulness that's been exploded out there right now. A tool I like to call out is another thing that Bob Keegan started over 20 years ago. It's his immunity to change framework. And his immunity to change framework, people can look it up online. There's a lot of wonderful tools out there. For the immunity to change framework is basically saying, I have an aspiration. I want to be able to toggle between mindsets more effectively. I write down a goal. Then I basically have to then surface, what are my competing commitments? What do I have as an internal commitment that stops me from making this change? And then looking at my big assumptions. So the idea of the immunity to change tool is to create a disciplined process of setting a new improvement goal, understanding what our objectives are, and then what our competing commitments are between. It's like, for example, if we want to go through a process of weight loss, I have a commitment to a diet, but I have a lot of other commitments to feeling comfortable, to, like, for example, enjoying using food for comfort or for stress management. I have to understand that competing commitment and the assumptions behind those commitments, because if I don't change my competing commitments and my internal big assumptions that anchor those commitments in place, then it's going to be very hard for me to change my behavior, because I'll go back to my old normal. And so Bob Keegan's tool is really great for surfacing the competing commitments that block us from change. And then mindfulness is a way for us to stay present with those challenges and look at them objectively so we can change them.
We talked earlier about the importance of maintaining a commitment to innovation, even perhaps accelerating it during the pandemic itself. But the pandemic is likely, I think it's safe to say, to be followed by a period, perhaps an extended period, of some pretty severe economic uncertainty. Innovation is often something that gets looked at for the chopping block as companies kind of, pull themselves in and just try to survive. So perhaps with a couple of minutes left, you could each offer some closing thoughts to leaders listening us today about how to maintain their commitment during this time. Scott?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, it helps when you've written a book on this topic, and I have. It not about pandemics. It was called The Silver Lining. It came out right after the global financial crisis. And the research that we did for that book was very, very stunningly clear. That is, opportunities to innovate and grow exist no matter how dark the times. So you see in any kind of crisis, you see established companies making big moves that separate themselves from competitors. Adobe started its very aggressive and impressive dual transformation starting in 2007 when Shantanu Narayan took over as the CEO of the company. Number two, you see great new companies born in the midst of a downturn. There were about 100 unicorns that came out in the global financial crisis, many of them reverbing off of parts of the crisis. So you have the asset sharing platforms are formed as people are a little bit tighter with their purse strings. You have new financial services providers like Stripe and Square because there isn't trust in mainstream providers. Similarly, we're going to see some awesome reverb opportunities that come out of this pandemic. And then the final thing you see is on the brink disruptors that have kind of laid the foundation. They go and take the next big step. And, of course, Zoom is one example that a lot of people talk about, but there are dozens of companies out there that are just knocking on the door of the mainstream that are going to do the same thing here. So I think the number one piece of advice to leaders is look to history and recognize that while it might not repeat, as Mark Twain said, it certainly rhymes. And we can see some really optimistic stories in the past, and those that have the courage to do it will reap the rewards. Those who don't will regret that they didn't.
Scott, thank you very much. Michael, if you've got 15 seconds for a goodbye, it's all yours.
I can't say I can't agree more. I've seen great companies, I've worked at great companies in the past. They look at these crises as opportunities to push forward on their disruptive initiatives. Absolutely, they move in, and sometimes they can see their competitors pulling back, and it's the perfect time to move forward. And I think there's no better time to move forward right now with your disruptive initiatives.
Great. Scott, Anthony, Michael Putz, thank you for getting our day off to a fantastic start.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.